There's a new development in a case that has already gripped an entire nation. 3 separate threads have emerged in recent weeks, each one pulling this story in a completely different direction. One of Nolan Wells' closest friends has now spoken publicly for the first time in his own words, directly addressing the questions that have followed him online for weeks. A father, unwilling to sit back and wait for official answers, has put his own money on the line to find out what really happened to his son. 2 sisters have come forward with an account that, if verified, could completely reshape the story everyone thought they already understood about Nolan's final hours on that island in Mississippi. We're not going to tell you what any of this means just yet, because once we lay it all out for you piece by piece, this case is going to look significantly different than it did 5 minutes ago. Before we go any further, we need to be completely transparent with you. This is a real case involving the loss of a real young life. Parts of what you're about to hear carry genuine weight. If that's something you need to prepare yourself for emotionally, we wanted you to know that up front. Now, before we begin walking through the timeline, if this is the first time you're hearing about this case, subscribe to Crime with Chris right now. Information is surfacing constantly in this investigation, and we are staying on this story until there are actual answers. We're reading every single comment, so let us know where you're watching from tonight. Let's begin with what we know for certain. Nolan Wells was 18 years old when his life ended under circumstances that remain, even now, the subject of intense scrutiny and public debate. The basic facts are not in dispute. Nolan spent time on an island in Mississippi with a group of friends during the summer. At some point during that gathering, something went wrong. Nolan did not come home. His family began searching. Authorities were contacted. Eventually, Nolan's body was recovered. What should have been a straightforward investigation into a tragic death became something far more complicated almost immediately, not because of what investigators found, but because of what they didn't say. In the days that followed, Nolan's family found themselves standing in a space that no parent should ever have to occupy. Their son was gone. They didn't know exactly why. They didn't know exactly how. The very people whose responsibility it was to provide those answers seemed to be moving at a pace the family found impossible to understand, let alone accept. For a parent in that position, silence does not feel neutral. Silence feels like information being deliberately withheld. That is the reality Nolan's family confronted during those first raw days following his death. Grief layered directly on top of uncertainty. No time to simply mourn, because mourning required first understanding. What exactly they were mourning? The questions were painfully basic. What happened to our son? Where are the autopsy results? Who saw him last? What do the witnesses say? These are not complex legal inquiries. These are the questions any family would ask, and the Wells family made clear they expected answers. The family's response was swift and strategic. They hired legal representation, specifically a civil rights attorney with experience handling cases where official channels were moving too slowly or not providing adequate transparency. The attorney's role was not merely symbolic. His legal team publicly committed to pressing for the release of records, witness statements, and autopsy findings the family said were not coming fast enough through official channels. They held press conferences. They demanded transparency at every stage of the investigation. They made clear, repeatedly, that their objective was not to assume guilt or innocence on anyone's part, but to make absolutely certain that nothing about this investigation happened quietly, out of public view, where accountability could not follow. At the center of why this case reached far beyond Mississippi is a detail that proved impossible to separate from the state's own history. In the photographs taken that day on the island, Nolan stood out visibly as the only black teenager in a group of white friends. For a story unfolding in Mississippi, a state whose past includes some of the most painful and difficult chapters in American history around race, that single detail was enough to make people stop scrolling and start paying serious attention. It's worth pausing on that for a moment, Because for many people watching from outside Mississippi, this case was never only about one missing 18-year-old. It became something larger the instant those photographs began circulating online. It became a reflection, a question that families across the country have carried for generations, quietly in the backs of their minds every time a loved one leaves home surrounded by people who don't share their history, their skin, their inherited sense of caution. Civil rights leaders who traveled to Mississippi in the weeks that followed did not shy away from addressing that history directly. At one gathering held in support of the family, the Reverend Al Sharpton stood beside Nolan's parents and spoke plainly. He said the case was not being framed exclusively around race, but that race was not being dismissed or ignored either. He called it a reminder of some of the deepest fears carried not only by Mississippi, but by the country as a whole. Others drew comparisons to names that carry lasting weight in that state's history. Names that have shaped how generations of black families in Mississippi have learned to move through the world with heightened awareness. Standing beside that history is a mother who never asked to become a symbol of anything. Christine Wells asked only for her son to come home. When he didn't, she asked only for someone, anyone, in a position of authority to tell her honestly what happened to him. For many watching from outside the state, that history is exactly why this case could not be treated as an isolated tragedy. Comment sections and online communities filled almost overnight with people sharing their own experiences of being the only person of color in similar settings. Strangers who had never met Nolan, who had never set foot in Mississippi, found themselves recognizing something painfully familiar in his story. It was a feeling many of them had carried quietly for years, suddenly given a name, a face, and a reason to speak it out loud. Whether or not race ultimately played any role in what happened to Nolan Wells, the public reaction made clear this case was tapping into something far larger than a single missing person report. At the same time, the family made a deliberate point of resisting attempts to frame their fight as an accusation against any specific person. What they said over and over in interviews and at press conferences was simple and consistent. They wanted a complete and fair investigation. They wanted every witness questioned. They wanted every piece of evidence examined, regardless of who it implicated or who it cleared. Christine Wells said publicly that the only question she truly cared about was the most basic one a parent can ask. What happened to my son? There is something almost unbearably simple about that question, and something almost unbearably cruel about how long it has taken to answer. Not who is guilty, not who should be punished, just what happened. 5 words. Weeks later, still no one had been able to give her a complete answer. That combination of a young life lost under circumstances no one could fully explain, a state carrying a history few are willing to look past, and a family refusing to let the case fade quietly out of the news cycle is what turned this from a local story into one followed by millions across the country. Support for the family grew well beyond Mississippi's borders. Public figures outside the legal world, including athletes and activists, began contributing resources to help fund independent efforts the family could not otherwise afford. It was a sign of just how far this case had traveled from where it started. Strangers thousands of miles away, who had never heard the name Nolan Wells before that summer, found themselves refreshing news pages late at night, waiting for updates the way you'd wait for word about someone in your own family. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a story reaches something people already carry inside themselves. Something that feels less like watching the news, and more like recognizing a fear they've lived with their entire lives. That is exactly why, weeks after Nolan Wells went missing, this case was still making headlines, still drawing crowds to press conferences, and still refusing to fade the way most news cycles eventually do. As the investigation continued without an official answer from the state, a second storyline began developing directly alongside it. This one had nothing to do with autopsy findings or grand jury timelines. It had everything to do with a much simpler, much older question. In a case this emotionally charged, who gets trusted to tell the truth, and who decides that in the first place? Enter Warren Hudson. Warren was 18 years old, one of Nolan's close friends, and someone whose name had been circulating online for weeks in connection with the case. In the vacuum of official information, speculation had filled the space. Warren's name began trending on social media alongside words like suspect and cover-up, even though no official charges had been filed and no public accusations had been made by law enforcement. For weeks, Warren said nothing publicly. Then everything changed. Warren agreed to sit down for an interview, not with a traditional news outlet, but with Officer Tatum, a former police officer turned political commentator with a substantial online following. This was not a brief soundbite. It was released across several parts, giving Warren an unusually long, largely uninterrupted window to speak directly to an audience of millions. The interview did not happen by chance. Tatum later addressed publicly how the connection came together, stating clearly he had no prior relationship with Warren's family before being approached. According to Tatum, he was contacted by a sitting Mississippi judge connected to Warren's family, someone he says he had never spoken to before that point, who reached out specifically asking him to give Warren a chance to tell his side of what happened. Tatum compared the decision to basic human instinct. He pointed to Nolan's own mother turning to a nationally recognized civil rights attorney to advocate on her son's behalf, arguing that families in the middle of tragedy naturally gravitate toward people they trust to represent them fairly, regardless of which side of a story they're standing on. In his telling, there was nothing calculated about it, just a family trying to protect one of their own from being tried and judged online before any official findings had even been released. That explanation did not settle the matter for a large portion of the public watching this play out. Almost immediately, a very different question started spreading across social media and competing broadcasts alike. Why him? Out of every journalist, every outlet, every established voice already covering this case, why would a family connected to it choose a commentator whose entire public identity had been built around a specific political brand and a well-known reputation for confrontation rather than neutral reporting? Underneath that debate, easy to lose sight of, was a teenager who had also lost a friend. Warren Hudson was 18 years old, watching his own name trend online next to words like suspect and cover-up, while trying to process the disappearance of someone he had grown up with. Whatever role he ultimately played or did not play in what happened on that island, it is worth remembering that he too was a young person suddenly living inside a national story with his name attached to it permanently. For Warren, the interviews became something else entirely, a chance finally to respond directly to weeks of assumptions that had been building around him online, with no input from him at all. On camera, he stated plainly that he had nothing to do with Nolan's death. He also addressed a separate accusation that had begun circulating online, that he had somehow deleted or altered content on Nolan's phone in the hours or days following his disappearance. Warren denied that claim directly and firmly, insisting he had no role in anything happening to that device. He also used the platform to explain one of the more scrutinized decisions he made in the weeks following Nolan's death: his absence from Nolan's own funeral. Warren said his family had received an overwhelming number of threats since Nolan first went missing. These threats, he said, extended beyond him to people around him as well. He explained he made the deliberate choice to stay away from the service, concerned that if he showed up, the day would stop being about honoring Nolan and instead become about him. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that decision, grieving a friend from a distance, unable to stand in the same room as the people who loved him because your own presence has become something the public can't separate from suspicion. Whatever the truth ultimately turns out to be, that is its own quiet tragedy sitting inside this larger one. As these interviews spread further, they stopped being simply a source of new information and became a subject of debate in their own right. Other commentators and public figures covering the story began weighing in, not on the underlying facts of what happened to Nolan, but on the decision to platform this particular version of events through this particular messenger. Critics argued that every time Tatum inserted himself deeper into the story, the public conversation shifted away from evidence and toward him personally, his interviews, his credibility, and his motives for taking on this story at all. Supporters pushed back just as firmly, arguing that after weeks of speculation playing out publicly, with no direct response from any of the teenagers involved, someone was finally giving them a chance to be heard directly in their own words. That divide between a family's right to shape how their own story gets told and a public's demand for coverage that feels neutral and credible became its own ongoing conflict, one that at times drew nearly as much attention online as the investigation into Nolan's death itself. Because in a story already carrying this much weight and this much scrutiny, the question of who the public chooses to believe mattered almost as much as the facts everyone was still waiting on. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, easy to forget beneath the arguments and the algorithms, is a family that simply wants their son remembered as more than a headline. Not a symbol, not a debate topic. A young man who, by every account from the people who actually knew him, was warm, easygoing, and loved by the people around him. Switching gears for a moment, away from the media conflict and back to the facts of the case itself, because 3 more details have surfaced in recent weeks that are shaping how the public understands what happened on that island, and none of them are fully settled yet. The first involves a claim that goes directly to one of the most contested points in this entire case: why Nolan stayed behind at all. Amid the flood of interviews and competing timelines, one account began circulating involving 2 names that had not been part of the official public record up to that point: Katie and her sister Gracie. According to this account, Katie was someone Nolan had been spending time with on the island that day. The specifics of that account, what the sisters allegedly saw or heard, and how their testimony might fit into the broader timeline, remain subjects of active discussion. What is clear is that any new witness statement, particularly one that addresses the critical question of why Nolan stayed on that island after others left, carries significant weight in a case where so much remains unexplained. The second development comes from Nolan's father. Frustrated by what the family has characterized as delays and lack of clarity from official channels, he made the decision to offer a financial reward for information leading to answers about what happened to his son. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a concrete action taken by a parent unwilling to sit back and wait while weeks turned into months without resolution. The reward represents more than money. It represents a father's refusal to let his son's case grow cold, to let public attention drift away before the family has received the answers they believe they are owed. The third development is the friend finally breaking his silence. Warren Hudson's decision to go public, regardless of how one feels about the platform he chose or the messenger who delivered his words, represents a turning point in the case. For weeks, the public had been speculating, theorizing, and in many cases outright accusing, all without hearing directly from the people who were actually there. Warren's interviews changed that dynamic. They gave the public a voice to attach to a name that had been circulating in accusatory tones across social media for weeks. Whether his account will ultimately be corroborated by evidence, contradicted by other witnesses, or fall somewhere in between remains to be seen. What cannot be denied is that his decision to speak, and the public reaction that followed, added yet another layer to an already complex case. This is where we stand right now. A family demanding answers. A friend defending himself publicly. A father putting up a reward. 2 sisters with a potential account about Nolan's final hours. A community divided over who to believe and what platform deserves credibility. An investigation that, according to the family, is not moving fast enough or transparently enough to satisfy basic questions about what happened to an 18-year-old who went to an island with friends and never came home. The story of Nolan Wells is not finished. The questions his mother has been asking since the beginning, simple, direct, heartbreaking questions, still do not have complete answers. What happened to my son? That question hangs over every development, every interview, every new piece of information that surfaces. It is the question that brought national attention to a case in Mississippi. It is the question that has kept strangers across the country refreshing news feeds and following updates. It is the question that, until it is answered fully and honestly, will continue to drive this story forward. If you want to stay with us through every development as this case continues to unfold, make sure you're subscribed to Crime with Chris and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. This is a story that is far from over, and we are committed to covering every twist, every revelation, and every step toward the truth. Like this video if you want to see us continue this coverage, and let us know in the comments what you think about the developments we've covered today. What has been separately confirmed through a police report obtained by national media is that friends who returned from the island told authorities Nolan stayed behind in the company of a young woman investigators described only as unfamiliar to them. Whether that woman is the same person referred to in circulating accounts as Katie has not been established. The claim goes further than just her presence. Gracie reportedly came forward and said something that directly contradicts one of the central narratives surrounding Nolan's final hours. According to this account, Gracie said Nolan never intended to stay behind at all, that he had planned to return to the mainland with his group like everyone else. If true, that would complicate a story that has circulated widely since this case first broke. The idea that Nolan made a deliberate, insistent choice to remain on the island, refusing repeated pleas from his friends to get in the boat. Commentators discussing Gracie's account have pointed out an inconsistency worth sitting with. If Nolan and Katie hadn't spent much time together that day, as this account also claims, it becomes harder to understand why he would have been so determined to stay behind without a ride back to shore. It is exactly the kind of detail that, if verified, could reshape a key piece of this case's timeline. It is exactly the kind of detail that right now remains unverified. No direct interview statement or documented source confirming Gracie's account has surfaced through major reporting on this case. That does not mean the claim is false. It means it hasn't yet been confirmed. What it leaves us with is two competing versions of Nolan's final hours. One describing a young man determined to stay behind. Another describing a young man who intended to leave the whole time. No official source has definitively settled which one is true. The second detail involves money, and the reaction to it has revealed almost as much about this case as the gesture itself. As pressure continued to build for anyone with information to come forward, Warren Hudson's father, a physician, made the decision to publicly offer a reward of $50,000 to anyone who could provide information relevant to the case. The moment that offer became public, it became a flashpoint in its own right, splitting public reaction almost immediately down two very different lines. To some, the reward looked exactly like what it was presented as. A father doing everything within his power to help push the investigation toward the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. To others, that same offer read as something far more calculated, with many online questioning why that kind of money would appear unless there was a specific outcome someone was trying to influence. It's worth being precise here because this is exactly the kind of moment where a case like this can tip into speculation if you're not careful. Neither interpretation has been confirmed. Not the version framing it as goodwill, and not the version framing it as concealment. What can be stated with certainty is only this: the reward was offered. It became public knowledge almost immediately. It added another layer of scrutiny to a case that already had no shortage of it. The third detail may end up being the single most consequential unanswered question in this entire case, and it centers on one word: alcohol. Multiple witnesses have told investigators Nolan had been drinking earlier that day on the island, and that drinking among the wider group appeared to increase as the afternoon went on. This account did not stay unchallenged for long. At least one member of the volunteer search and recovery team, directly involved in locating Nolan, came forward publicly to push back on it, stating that based on what he personally understood, Nolan's condition that day did not reflect someone who was heavily intoxicated. As of right now, there is no official toxicology report from the state confirming either version. Until that report is released, this detail sits exactly where the rest of this case sits, completely unresolved and central to understanding what happened before Nolan entered the water. Think for a moment about what it means to be a parent right now, still waiting on a single lab report to tell you something as basic as what your child's body can and cannot confirm about his final hours. That is not an abstract legal detail. That is a mother lying awake at night, still not knowing. That is where the confirmed facts of this case currently stand, and it's worth laying them out clearly one final time. A young man went out to an island with a group of friends on a holiday afternoon and did not come home. What happened in the hours before he entered the water remains to this date formally undetermined, not by speculation or online commentary, but by both the state's own medical examiner and the independent pathologist the family brought in specifically to get answers no one else seemed willing to provide. Whether Nolan was conscious, and whether he entered the water on his own or under some other circumstance remains the single question every credentialed expert connected to this case agrees matters most, and the one still sitting completely unanswered. Behind every one of those clinical, careful words, undetermined, unresolved, unconfirmed, is a family who does not get to speak in those same careful terms. To them, this isn't a pending finding. It's their son. It's an empty chair at dinner. It's a bedroom that hasn't changed since the 4th of July, because changing it would mean accepting that he isn't coming back to it. Just when it seemed like this case couldn't take on another layer, a piece of audio surfaced that reignited the entire conversation overnight. It came from an unlikely source, not a leaked video, not something pulled off social media. The Mississippi Department of Marine Resources released it directly, a recorded call placed to a boat assistance service on the day Nolan Wells disappeared. On the recording, a young voice can be heard telling the dispatcher that the boat is taking on water near the western tip of Horn Island and that it's going down. By itself, that call is what you'd expect from any boat in trouble that day. A request for help, confusion about a membership number, a dispatcher calmly working through the basics, asking how high the water has risen, asking if everyone on board is safe. But it wasn't the confirmed parts of the call that set off a new wave of attention. It was what some listeners believed they heard underneath it. In the background, layered beneath the main conversation, voices faint and overlapping that some interpreted as expressions of panic and concern for someone not present on the boat. That interpretation spread quickly once the recording became public, and it did not take long before it landed squarely in the middle of an already tense national conversation. Was this evidence of something the group had been hiding? Or was it simply the sound of stressed teenagers reacting to a boat they believed was sinking beneath them? Brandon Tatum addressed the recording directly and pushed back hard on the more alarming interpretation. He argued that the timeline made it effectively impossible for the background voices to be reacting to Nolan, because according to what he says, multiple witnesses told him separately, and before this audio ever surfaced, Nolan was seen alive on the island after the boat carrying his friends had already left. He referenced a young woman connected to Nolan that day, who he says indicated in a message that she never saw him get on that boat at all. It's worth being clear here. This detail comes directly from Tatum's account of witness statements he says he collected and has not been independently confirmed through an official investigative source. Tatum also raised a broader point about the sheer number of people on the water that day. Horn Island, he noted, was crowded that 4th of July with hundreds of boats and beachgoers nearby. His argument was simple. If something serious had happened in that moment, it's reasonable to expect someone somewhere close by would have noticed. Not everyone agreed with that reasoning. A trial attorney brought in to weigh the claim countered that being surrounded by people is no guarantee that anyone is truly watching. He pointed to something well documented in cases involving crowded public spaces, that people often fail to register something significant happening right in front of them, especially when they have no reason yet to think it matters. It's only later, once something becomes significant, that memory tends to sharpen around it. That same debate carried directly into the discoveries made during the second independent autopsy. Investigators and forensic experts have spent weeks focused on a small defined area of discoloration found at the back of Nolan's head. Some have argued this detail may be getting more attention than it deserves, calling it a distraction from clearer answers still pending. Forensic specialists who reviewed the diagram from that exam pushed back firmly on that characterization, pointing out that the marking has a distinct, defined shape, unlike more random patterns you'd typically expect from simple decomposition. What it does not yet have is a conclusive explanation. The examiner who documented it was careful to note that due to the condition of the body by the time of the second autopsy, he could not determine one way or another what caused it. Equally unresolved is why certain parts of Nolan's body, specifically internal structures within the neck, were not included when his body was sent for that second independent examination. Experts who spoke to this detail explained that retaining these structures is not unusual in cases where investigators want the ability to examine them further or preserve them for any future proceedings. It does not on its own confirm anything, but it does mean the second pathologist was left working without a complete picture. It's part of why his final conclusion remained the same word that has followed this case from the very beginning: undetermined. Even the authenticity of the distress call itself became its own point of dispute. Digital forensics specialists who examined it noted that any version circulating publicly had likely been adjusted in some way simply through the process of being shared, compressed, and re-uploaded across different platforms and news outlets. Enhancing audio to bring out background sound is a widely used, legitimate technique, but experts caution that enhancement is only as reliable as the process behind it, and that any analysis presented publicly needs to be traceable back to the original unaltered recording obtained directly from marine resources, not a version that had already been edited, clipped, or shared secondhand. What all of this amounts to, weeks later, is not a resolution. It's a magnification. The same unanswered question at the heart of this case, what happened to Nolan Wells in his final hours, has now expanded to include a second unanswered question. What, if anything, does this recording actually capture? As renewed attention brought the case back into the national spotlight, additional reward money was also introduced, separate from the reward already offered by Warren Hudson's father, aimed specifically at generating new leads for investigators still working to piece together that day. What happens next could shape the entire direction this case takes from here forward. The local district attorney has stated that once the investigation is complete, the findings will be brought before a grand jury, and it will be the grand jury's decision whether anyone connected to that day on the island ever faces formal charges. No date has been set. No outcome has been decided or even hinted at by anyone with actual authority over this case. Until that grand jury convenes, everyone connected to this story remains exactly where they've been for weeks now. Nolan's family, the friends who were there that day, and the public watching from every corner of the country, still waiting for something that resembles an answer. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with that kind of waiting, not the loud, dramatic grief people expect to see on camera, but the quiet, grinding kind. The kind that doesn't get easier with time, because time isn't actually offering anything to hold on to. Just more days without answers. More headlines that say the same thing in slightly different words. Still undetermined. Still pending. Still waiting. And yet, in the middle of all of that uncertainty, one thing has remained completely consistent since the very first day this story broke. A mother's refusal to let her son's name simply disappear into a closed file somewhere. A refusal to let silence be the final word on what happened to him. Whatever the grand jury eventually decides, whatever the toxicology results eventually reveal, Nolan Wells will not be remembered as a case number. He will be remembered as someone's son, someone's friend, a young man who went out on the water on a summer afternoon expecting to come home, the same as anyone else would have. This case keeps evolving, sometimes overnight, and it is far from over. If you want to be here the moment the next piece of this story breaks, make sure you're subscribed to Crime with Chris and notifications are turned on. because when new information comes out, we're going to be the ones breaking it down for you first. Hit that like button if you want us to keep following this case, and let us know in the comments what stood out to you most from everything we covered today. We'll see you in the next update.